The story of Bermuda begins with the story of the New World itself. The epic voyage of Christopher Columbus in 1492 opened the way, and soon he was followed by the adventurers of Europe, skilled mariners and freebooters alike, each seeking their fortune in the tantalizing unknown lands to the west. In just a few years, scores of ships were following the southern routes to the longed-for riches of the West Indies and beyond. They soon learned their surest way back followed a course to the north, swinging east for home as they sighted a strange group of remote, uninhabited islands and dangerous coral reefs, the islands we now know as Bermuda. Bermuda took its name from the man thought to have first glimpsed the forbidding reefs in 1503 or 1505, the Spaniard Juan de Bermudez in his ship the Heron. He was a master navigator who made as many as 12 Atlantic crossings, and may even have been aboard the Santa Maria with Columbus. His discovery was passed from seafarer to seafarer, and it wasn't long before Bermuda became an important signpost in the wild Atlantic Ocean. But while the island was vital as a landmark, the treacherous reefs and frequent storms instead made it a place to be feared. The tranquility of today's Bermuda belies its fearsome reputation in years gone by. Many ships loaded with the spoils of the New World became victims of the merciless reefs. One small mistake, a sleepy lookout, or a sudden ferocious storm might deliver an unwary vessel into the island's clutches. Today, hundreds of wrecks ring the island, testimony to its dangerous beauty, and there are likely many more waiting to be found. Some have already given up their treasures. For us, a fascinating snapshot of the age of discovery, the hopes, fears, greed, and excitement of men who made a great leap into the unknown, and very often paid with their lives. Few of these voyagers had any thought of making landfall on Bermuda, and those lucky enough to survive shipwreck were either rescued or built another vessel for themselves and sailed away. Normally, no sign remains of such occasional visits, except for one mysterious carving that survived along Bermuda's south shore until recent years. The inscription on what later became known as Spanish Rock included the date 1543. We now know that a Portuguese ship was temporarily marooned in that year, and its unhappy crew were probably the authors of the inscription. This also was an age of superstition. Belief in demons and devilry was common, and in Europe, ordinary people were burning thousands of their friends and neighbors as witches. For untutored sailors of the day, storm-racked Bermuda soon earned a frightening, otherworldly reputation. The island teemed with noisy seabirds which wheeled over the heads of terrified visitors, who in turn believed the birds were evil spirits. Before long, Bermuda was being called the Isle of Devils, and given as wide a berth as possible. In 1603, the first documented visit by a black man called Venturia illustrates the terrors Bermuda could induce in sailors of the day. After his treasure ship was driven across the reefs by a storm, Venturia was sent ashore to cut wood for a new rudder, while his shipmates muttered about chattering devils possessing the flocks of seabirds surrounding them. They watched anxiously as Venturia, armed with an axe, vanished into the cedar forest. Moments later, he let out a yell, and the sailors, convinced their shipmate was being carried off by the devil, overcame their fear and rushed ashore to help. They found Venturia struggling not against devils, but thrashing his arms among a colony of startled cahows. After so long at sea, the sailors knew a fresh meal when they saw one, and before long they had killed hundreds of curious birds for the ship's larder. Seabirds and turtles were once in abundance in Bermuda, and voyagers soon realized the island was a useful high seas convenience store when supplies were low. Spanish captains had the foresight to let loose a herd of hogs on the island, so that future travelers or castaways might have a ready supply of meat. For almost 100 years, the hogs multiplied and had the island more or less to themselves. Bermuda remained an uninhabited landmark for wary sailors. There was one half-hearted attempt to colonize the island in the early 1500s, A nobleman from the Azores won a license from the King of Spain to set up a colony on Bermuda, but nothing ever came of his ambitious plans. Things remained so until the late 16th century, and the rise of England as a sea power to be reckoned with. Queen Elizabeth I, the famous Virgin Queen, had built up her nation to withstand her powerful Spanish rivals, and she too began sending expeditions to the New World. These early attempts ended in disaster, but once Spain was dealt with and its invasion armada destroyed in 1588, English colonists began looking to settle on the North American mainland. After several false starts, the English made a tenuous foothold in Virginia in 1607, where adventurers eked out a meager existence in a strange new land. They had little knowledge of agriculture or survival in the new home they had called Jamestown, and desperately needed help from England. And so, on June the 2nd, 1609, the Virginia Company dispatched a small relief fleet for the starving colony. At the head of 8 ships sailing out of Plymouth was the flagship the Sea Venture, itself carrying supplies and 150 new colonists for Jamestown. In command was Admiral Sir George Somers, who ordered his captain, Christopher Newport, to take a more northerly and more direct route than was usual. At first there was fair sailing, the colonists, rich and poor, young and old, looking forward to the challenging new life ahead of them. Good weather followed the fleet as they made comfortable progress. Then, 7 weeks into their voyage and barely 1 week from Virginia, the seas suddenly grew as a colossal storm began to blow. In hours, the fleet was in the grip of a murderous Atlantic hurricane, with towering seas and fearsome winds. Almost immediately, the fleet was scattered, each ship fighting for its own survival as the others were lost to view. Sailors frantically furled the sails as the lumbering Sea Venture wallowed in the grip of the storm. Frightening as it was, the storm was to become even more terrifying, a nightmare in which the huddled colonists expected to be drowned at any moment.
This was not all. It pleased God to bring a greater affliction yet upon us. For in the beginning of the storm we received a mighty leak, and the ship was grown suddenly 5 foot deep with water above her ballast, and we almost drowned within whilst we sat looking to perish from above. This, imparting no less terror than danger, ran through the whole ship with much fright and amazement, and started and turned the blood, and took down the braves of the most hardy mariner of them all, insomuch as he that before happily felt not the sorrow of others, now began to sorrow for himself, when he saw such a pond of water so suddenly broken in, and which he knew could not but presently sink him. So, as joining in the public safety, there might be seen master, master's mate, boatswain, quartermaster, coopers, carpenters, and who not, with candles in their hands, creeping along the ribs, viewing the sides, searching every corner and listening in every place if they could hear the water run. Many a weeping leak was this way found, and hastily stopped, and at length one in the gun-room was made up with I know not how many pieces of beef. But all was to no purpose. The leak, if there were but one, which drunk in our greatest seas and took in our destruction fastest, could not be found. William Strachey, Secretary-elect to Virginia.
In the panic and mayhem, as George Somers fought to keep the ship afloat, Thomas Gates took charge. Sir Thomas, who was destined to be the future governor of Jamestown, split the passengers and crew into 3 groups and set them about the seemingly impossible task of bailing out the foundering ship. The colonists had no idea their labors would last a full 3 days, and hour on and hour off, as the water continued to rise in the hold, finally as deep as 10 feet.
During all this time, the heavens looked so black upon us that it was not possible the elevation of the pole might be observed, nor a star by night, nor sunbeam by day was to be seen. We steered as much as we could to bear upright, which was no small pain to do, albeit we unrigged the ship, threw overboard much luggage, many a trunk, chest, and heaved away all our ordnance. We now purposed to cut down the mainmast, the more to lighten her, as we were much spent, and our men so weary as their strength together failed them, having travailed from Tuesday until Friday, day and night, without either sleep or food. It now being the fourth morning, there was a general determination to shut up the hatches and, commending our sinful souls to God, commit the ship to the mercy of the sea. Surely we must have done it and then perished. But Sir George Somers, when no man dreamed of such happiness, discovered and cried, "Land!" We found it to be the dangerous and dreaded island of Bermuda, feared and avoided of all sea travelers alive, above any other place in the world. This hideous and hated place, both the place of our safety and means of our deliverance. William Strachey.
At the point of giving up, the crew found fresh strength. Somers quickly realized there was no chance of safely navigating the complicated reefs around the island, and in desperation was forced to run the Sea Venture aground on a reef some 3/4 of a mile offshore. Now close to safety, the voyagers lowered their longboats and struggled to land. By the end of the day, they slumped exhausted on the shore. Boatloads of priceless provisions had been saved, and amazingly all 150 passengers and crew. Not one life lost in their ordeal. The bewildered colonists had no choice but to make the best of their bad luck. Somers and Gates ordered their men to cut cedar from the thick forests blanketing the islands and get to work building one and later a second new ship to take them on to Virginia. The rest of the survivors began taking in their new surroundings and were amazed to find the Isle of Devils was in fact a small paradise with food and game in abundance. Setting up camp near modern-day St. George's, the castaways at first planted their stock of English seeds. And not surprisingly, their European peas and lettuce quickly withered and died under Bermuda's subtropical sun. But there was little fear of starvation. The castaways took huge hauls of strange-colored fish and lobsters. They gathered sea turtle eggs or killed the turtles themselves. They hunted the wild hogs that roamed all over the islands. And, like sailors before them, they killed and ate great numbers of tame seabirds. Trouble soon raised its head. Many asked why they should press on to Virginia, where life would certainly be harder. Unrest and mutiny rumbled on, tragically resulting in one man being executed by firing squad. The castaways had no idea the rest of their fleet had in fact made it safely to Jamestown. But it was decided the master's mate, Henry Ravens, should attempt to reach Virginia in the Sea Venture's longboat. William Strachey organized a constant watch and kept signal fires burning. But after many weeks, it was realized that Ravens and the 8 men he took with him would never be seen again. Meanwhile, George Somers took it upon himself to map out the island they had stumbled onto. He built a small boat and made a detailed chart of the entire island group, which for a while became known as the Somers Islands. And then at last it was time to go. The shipbuilders finished their task, and after 9 months on Bermuda, all but 2 people took sail in the Deliverance and the Patience, and 10 days later found their way to Virginia. They found the Jamestown colonists in a far worse state than themselves. There was barely a handful left alive, and their provisions were almost gone. The situation was so grave that George Somers decided to take the Patience back to Bermuda for more of the island's plentiful supplies. Unfortunately, Sir George gave not only his name to the Somers Islands, but also his life. He died in Bermuda in 1610. His nephew Matthew took the admiral's body home to England. His heart remains buried in St. George's. Back in England, there was much excitement about Bermuda. William Strachey sent home a chilling account of the great storm and the Sea Venture wreck. This and other pamphlets describing the disaster stirred many imaginations, including the great playwright William Shakespeare, for we hear echoes of Strachey's account in the Bard's play, The Tempest. Especially excited were members of the Virginia Company who had funded the expedition. They were impressed by the assumed natural wealth of Bermuda, including reports of a great store of pearls, and imagined immense fortunes to be made. And so it was that the profit-hungry company of adventurers and planters of the City of London for the first colony of Virginia voted to return to Bermuda in force, this time to officially colonize the island. In 1612, the company sent 50 settlers under the command of Governor Richard Moore in the ship the Plough to establish a permanent colony. They made their base the town of St. George's, known briefly as New London, on St. George's Island. Stone buildings sprang up around a town square, stocks to punish wrongdoers. There were bridges over a now dried-up creek, and work began on St. Peter's Church, a St. George's landmark still standing today as one of the oldest churches in the West. Its beautiful cedar work, a reminder of days gone by. Most important, though, was defense. By now, England was at peace with Spain, but fears the Spanish would break that peace and finally try to snatch Bermuda for their own. The King of Spain received constant reports from his envoys warning that the English were settling an island uncomfortably close to Spain's rich treasure ship sea lanes. Luckily for Governor Moore and his settlers, the Spanish failed to act decisively. The colonists hastily threw up the strongest fortifications they could, and in just a few years had completed a string of formidable forts to guard the already hazardous channels into Bermuda.
When the first settlers arrived in Bermuda in 1612, the very first thing that they did was to begin to build Bermuda's forts. The Governor Moore had been made to understand before he left England that the Spanish considered Bermuda theirs, and the English expected that they would come back and try to disrupt the new colony and take over the island. And so when Governor Moore arrived in 1612, he built for himself a few shelters in St. George's with his, to shelter his people, and then immediately he went out to what is now called Paget Island and built the first fort to protect St. George's town.
Not that the settlers had all the means necessary to repulse the Spanish threat. As early as 1614, a passing Spanish captain decided to see for himself what the English were up to. As the Spaniard picked his way slowly through the channels, he spotted the newly built King's Castle on Castle Island.
When Bermuda was first settled, the colonists, as it were, came out on a sort of private enterprise thing to make a new life for themselves, only to find, certainly in one instance, that they had to spend a great deal of time and labor working on building the fortifications of Bermuda. This was, of course, to defend Bermuda against the Spanish, and they built 10 forts as masonry forts in the first decade of settlement, and 2 of them were on King's Castle, or Castle Island.
The English defenders at first thought the newcomer was a friend and sent out a rowboat to guide it in. But when they realized their error, Governor Moore and his gunners let loose 2 cannon shots.
Well, this was a good thing because apparently, according to one account of the Times, they only had 3 cannonballs, of which they used 2, and in firing those 2, they managed to spill the powder, the gunpowder, underneath the cannon, and with a spare spark, the whole lot could have gone up and we would be speaking Spanish today. These fortifications were very important to maintain the island against the Spanish, and they were the first masonry fortifications built by the British overseas. All the earlier ones, of which there are only 2 or 3, were built in timber, and they soon vanished, and ours remain as wonderful monuments to the beginning of the British Empire outside of Europe.
Within 10 years, the colonists had built 10 stone forts to guard their new home. An attack never came, but so far away from home, isolated and alone, they remained constantly vigilant.
The building of forts was considered very important by the early leaders of the island, and to a large extent, the growing of food was ignored. Most of the early settlers spent most of their time digging ditches or building walls or doing the type of thing that you had to do to produce a fort. As a result, there was a chronic food shortage in the early days of the island's history.
Their security established, the new Bermudians got down to the serious business of making their fortunes. By 1615, title to the island had been transferred to the newly formed Somers Island Company, also known as the Bermuda Company, which was to operate the island for the next 69 years. The company's purpose was to make money, and it declared certain sources of revenue to be its alone. The thick cedar forests were reserved for company profit, as were pearls, whale oil, silk, and tobacco. There was also a great deal of enthusiasm over a piece of ambergris found by 3 men who had remained from 1610. Ambergris, a rare waxy substance from the stomach of whales, was highly prized as an ingredient in perfume making and commanded enormous prices in London. The settlers began scouring the shoreline for more. To Governor Moore's dismay, the early promise of pearls proved empty. The hope of silk production came to nothing, and to cap it all, no more ambergris was found. Moore returned to England to plead with the grumbling investors, and was promptly replaced by Daniel Tucker, a tough, no-nonsense plantation owner who immediately set the colonists to work much harder than ever before. Tucker also brought with him a shipment of coins for the fledgling colony, the first Bermuda currency, which was called hog money. Nevertheless, coinage was less than practical for a rough and ready settlement like Bermuda. What everyday people needed was something they could use and barter. And tobacco, the mainstay crop of early Bermuda, fit the bill perfectly. For years, tobacco was used as money, and strict rules were drawn up regarding its use. In 1626, it was decreed that a master carpenter or mason should be paid 2 pounds of tobacco a day. A skilled man earned 1.5 pounds. A lowly labourer would merit 1 pound. In the early days, indentured servants, both black and white, would be hired out for a fee in tobacco. As Bermuda sadly moved to a slave culture during the early 1600s, slaves too would be hired to others or sold outright for a tobacco payment. The tobacco leaf even extended to the settlers' love lives. In 1621, certain young maids, an early form of mail-order brides, were shipped from England and each sold for 100 pounds of tobacco to any lonely colonist who could pay the price. The colony began to thrive, and the authorities demanded a new map of Bermuda to help speed growth. The task fell to Richard Norwood, a mathematician and navigator who completed 3 surveys, dividing Bermuda into the 8 tribes we today call parishes. The Bermuda Company in London also decided to set up a parliament, where the Bermuda colonists could have a voice in their own affairs. The assembly was inaugurated in 1620 in the newly built St. Peter's Church in St. George's by Governor Tucker's successor, Nathaniel Butler, and later moved into the elegant State House which still stands today. The assembly had limited powers, but it was a starting point on the road to democracy and the universal suffrage we enjoy today. Bermuda's parliament remains one of the oldest in the world. 1645. The English Civil War was over, and the defeated King, Charles I, was humiliated, put on trial, and beheaded. His victorious rival, the parliamentarian leader Oliver Cromwell, was supported by a group known as the Puritans, Protestant extremists known in Bermuda as the Independents. When news of the King's execution reached the island, royalist colonists were enraged and called out the Bermuda militia. This volunteer army swiftly marched on St. George's, where they deposed the governor and set their leader John Trimmingham in his place. In London, Parliament immediately declared Bermuda to be in a state of rebellion. And although the dispute never came to blows, before long the Bermuda Company contrived to replace Trimmingham as governor, and peace was restored. The Bermuda Company itself did not have much time left to it. The old question of profits continued to vex shareholders who after several decades had still not seen their fortunes made from elusive pearls and ambergris. At one time, whaling had seemed a profitable venture, and the settlers produced large quantities of whale oil. But after a few years, this industry began to dwindle. Worse yet, the tobacco trade in Bermuda was in steep decline, outshone by the flourishing plantations in Virginia. The company's shareholders reacted harshly, imposing strict rules and regulations on the colonists. Bermudians were forbidden from trading with any ship that did not belong to the Bermuda Company, and to add to the insult, were forced to pay high prices for goods the company imported. The colonists were also banned from trading with the American colonies and not even allowed to build ships from the abundant Bermuda cedar. The once promising island was in deep trouble, being eclipsed by other colonies, its economy in a shambles. Eventually, the Bermuda Company was dissolved, and in 1684, the British government took control of the island, sending out its own governor. England was not inheriting a thriving colony. Although more than 8,000 people now lived in the islands, 2 whites for every black, they needed new ways to sustain themselves if Bermuda was not to become an insignificant speck in the Atlantic. At the same time, what had begun as the use of indentured servants was growing into outright slavery. By the time the Bermuda Company was disbanded, the ownership of slaves had become commonplace, and for the unfortunates condemned to a lifetime of servitude, the future would remain bleak and hopeless. But for others, their free masters, a new chapter was opening for Bermuda, which would see its inhabitants reach out to new ideas and new lands for survival.
These slaves are the most proper and cheap instrument for this plantation that can be. Governor Nathaniel Butler.
The second group came when the Earl of Warwick's interest went toward the Spanish West Indies. He realized in his projects that the Spanish West Indies provided more than just plant products as well as competition. It also provided expert labor when it came to tobacco.
Gradually, blacks found themselves being transferred between masters with contracts for ever-lengthening periods of service. To their horror, it became common to be sold for a period of 419 years, 99 years. In other words, for life.
So the 99-year indenture was perfect. It didn't enslave anybody because they were still free. Their children were free, their products were free. But it also, on the other hand, ensured that you would have a